Another problem is what happens with, so I was talking about teacher time, but what about the content, right? And this is, everyone talks about the teaching to the test, right?
Exactly.
So there's a common sense that tells us, there's some interesting work that comes out of a group called Frameworks Institute out of Boston. And what they did is, they did a series of studies that tried to figure out how does the everyday American think and talk about education reform. When we say education, what comes to people's minds? And they talked about all sorts of things, but one of the things that they talked about is curriculum. When we talk about what students should be learning and who's struggling, the common sense tells us that if students are struggling, we need to go back to the basics, right? All this other stuff is actually a distraction from the most fundamental things. If you learn the basic reading and math, then you're ready to learn the more complicated da-da-da-da-da. It kind of makes some sense, right? That kind of hits common sense. Until you look at what the research tells us, right? That the research tells us that the way students are more likely to learn basic reading and math is when those subjects are integrated throughout the disciplines, right? So if you isolate the skill sets, they're not as likely to learn them as if when they're integrated. So the research does not reflect the common sense. But of course, the common sense drives how we respond to these imperatives. So if you're required to meet these high stakes testing requirements, and students are not doing well, then what's the common sense tell us? Let's narrow the curriculum. So what happens to, again I go back to something Lisa Delpit once said, which is if students are struggling and they're falling behind, doesn't that mean that they need more, not less, to get caught up? But what are we doing? We're actually giving them less, right, if they're falling behind. And let me make one more point, and then I'll kind of get to my larger argument. One other point I would make is, I lost my train of thought. So anyway, let me just keep going then. So if students are getting less, this is one way that we see that the high stakes testing is furthering the divide between the schools that are doing well and that have, and the schools that are struggling and have not, right? The more that students struggle on tests, the more regulated the teacher's work is, the more narrow the curriculum is, right? In other words, the less those schools are looking like the most elite schools, right? The most elite schools have enormous autonomy for teachers, right? Teachers develop the curriculum, they don't have to do as much reporting, the curriculum is incredibly rich, right? The more that students struggle, the less we make those schools look like the best schools. So that's the absolute opposite that we should be saying is what education reform is supposed to look like. But it makes all the sense if you recognize that one of the primary functions of public schooling has always been to sort students, right? We created, when we first created public schools, what is that?
The hidden curriculum.
Exactly. And it's both the hidden curriculum and kind of the structural reality of schools, right? We first created public schools for only certain students. And then as we were forced to integrate more, we segregated schools. And as we were forced to end segregation, which by the way has not ended at all, then we tracked students, right? Oh, actually we've always tracked students. But the point is we've always differentiated and we've always sorted. And all we've done over time, we've not gone away from that function. We've simply become more indirect in terms of how we sort students. And this is just a wonderful example of the insidious nature of reforms, that we can claim that it's all about closing the gap, but really it is furthering the distinction, right? And that's, I think, one of the things that we need to do when we try to reframe the debate and push back, is say, all right, how do we reframe the debate? We need to look at the bigger picture, right? What has schools always been doing? And how does what we're doing now actually accomplish that? That was another question.
That's exactly, you're moving right into that. That's great, yeah. So yes, that's exactly, we noticed that in your website there, you were talking about reframing the debate and how the whole common sense, well, what I wanted to ask you actually about that was, since we have a Democratic president in Congress, why is a theory such as common sense still, being promoted or perpetuated?
Yeah, so I wrote a book a few years ago called, like all promoting myself right now, right?
No, we love it. We love it. This is great. Thank you.
Don't worry, it's gonna get like 33 hits on YouTube. So
Yeah. No,
Good.
this is great.
So,
come on.
oh, it's locked. It's locked.
Oh, it's a lock. Oh shoot.
That's all right. So we have Democratic leaders right now, and that totally fits into, I think, the newest line of my work. So I was mentioning that a few years ago I wrote a book called The Seduction of Common Sense, which was about how the right, the conservative movement in the United States, has really defined education reform and has been incredibly influential. Well, right now, the difference between right and left is really hard to see, right? People we would normally think of as conservative and people we would normally think of as liberal are all kind of saying the same thing. And this has been the case for over a decade, right? No Child Left Behind, Bush's policy, who was one of the major co-sponsors? It was Ted Kennedy, right? One of the most liberal members of the Democratic Party. And No Child Left Behind, a lot of that was written during the Clinton administration, not only Bush, right? So and people would argue that Race to the Top takes us even further down the original the goals that the conservative movement had put out there decades earlier, which was about privatizing education, which was about all these interesting things that we see happening in Race to the Top and the Clinton and the Obama administration. So what I've now begun talking about is how I think that the right, the conservative movement, is still incredibly influential at putting out the vision, right? The vision that the right put out, decades ago with privatizing schools, decades ago with this whole move towards standards and accountability. That's still the language that we use. But what I have come to really, you all are popular right now, right? That's right. What I think has shifted is that the vision that the right was putting out earlier has now really become so commonsensical that everyone is putting it forward, right? Part of what I argued in my earlier work is that the left, some of our initiatives, the more liberal initiatives, are in the end advancing the goals of the right. But now it's become very mainstream for everyone to kind of say this is the way that we should be moving. And so what the Obama and Duncan kind of take on education has done is it's really bought into several stories about what it means to improve education, right? One of them is, well, there's a number. Okay, I'll pick two. One of them is that competition is what drives improvement. This is kind of what we call the neoliberal ideology. That if you think of everything, you think of a context like a neighborhood, and you think of grocery stores in a neighborhood, it's the competition between the stores that's going to drive improvement, right? If you're hardworking and you're innovative, you're going to succeed, everyone else is going to fall out. And this is the model that we seem to think is going to improve education. Now, this model has a history to it, right? This is very much the kind of free enterprise model that was developed by the Chicago school, right? The Milton Friedman folks. And it defined global policies around economic reform for decades, for really the past half a century. It's absolutely defined economic policy here within the past few decades, and within the past decade or two, it's really become defining education policy as well. So there's a lot of things that we see that has shifted how the federal government has seen its role. During the so-called federal era, which is, the mid-1900s to like the 1980s or so, this is a time when the federal government began to become much more influential in public schooling reform. And its role was as much kind of the bully pulpit, right, trying to push states to do things, as how it used its funding. The federal government tried to use its funding in ways that made up for gaps on targeted populations.